Hello, and welcome to part 2 of iGaming Daily's exclusive feature podcast with Antony Gevisser of Supergroup in his dissection of the clear and present threats of the black market. In part 2, Antony highlights why regulatory inertia has impacted the ability to combat the black market's encroachment, an issue all stakeholders must confront. The iGaming Daily podcast is brought to you by Optimove, the #1 CRM solution for the global gambling industry. So welcome to part 2, and again we're joined by Antony Gevisser of Supergroup. And Anthony, I've just been reviewing my notes from our first discussion, and one thing that stands out about this subject matter is just the number of stakeholders involved. And how do you think we can get any coordination on even beginning to tackle the black market when you have, not only the betting industry, the regulators, governments, local authorities, crime forces, and even online platforms in themselves? Like, where do you start there?
Look, I think it's a good question. And I think in your question, you've already suggested, which is correct, that this is a big task. So how can you be effective when you're dealing with a global problem where black marketeers are in the business of not being found? And they do that very well. And they tend to be one step ahead, as criminals tend to be. So I think the first solution here is to make sure that this discussion, and I thank you for that and other people who are spreading the word of discussing that this is an issue, that it's a global issue. In a lot of the instances, it's being driven by the same operators. And I believe that the more it's discussed here in articles, on panels, at conferences, wherever this ecosystem is relevant, the more traction it's going to get, the more attention it's going to get, and the more the powers that be will be able to focus on a way themselves as to how they would do that. So there's that. There's a need, I think, for more global enforcement agencies to have a good look at this, and I think it's their interest to do that because we're talking about global money laundering here. And if you talk about the likes of Interpol or other global enforcement agencies that could start having a look at this, I think that could be a way to do that. How you get their attention, that's a good question. This is partly how to do it. I also believe that a lot of the time, the relevant ministries of finance in countries are not part of that discussion. In some countries, Ted, the regulator is a ministry of finance. So you don't really have that problem. But in many countries, regulators are not ministries of finance. And not only do they not speak to each other, but sometimes they have different methods of going about what they do. And I think that if more ministries of finance and tax departments were aware of the fiscal implications of the black market, I think you'd get a lot more effective results because finance ministries and tax departments are very good at going after people. And of course, where tax evasion becomes involved as a criminal offense, that could be a situation where the black marketeers become increasingly uncomfortable.
So in the first part, you gave us this example of a player going off-grid. And here I want to kind of talk to you about what do you think the accountability is on the online platforms, on your Googles, your Twitters, your Facebooks, right? To safeguard that consumer from that exposure. I mean, isn't that the kind of the start point of where the customer is exposed?
I think that's correct. I think there's social networking platforms such as Facebook, TikTok, and the like. There is also Telegram, Signal, and these providers. And yes, I believe they have a responsibility and they have to. But, these do they do it themselves at their own instance, usually, or are they pushed by enforcement agencies, governments? It's more the latter, to be honest. I don't see a lot of these businesses, social networking businesses that are facilitating this as proactively doing anything about it. So it's, I find ourselves drawing it to their attention more often. I find that some regulators are trying, I've seen examples of it in Germany, to try and work more closely with the likes of Google and come to some agreements, or to share blacklists. But you're right. I do think that a great way to constrict this black market is to go after the facilitators and the social networking platforms and the payment service providers and the affiliates and anyone who's assisting in driving this. And there's also software providers who could be looked at more closely. I think that's probably the most effective way of constricting this black market. And Ted, I'm very careful to always use the word constrict, because you ain't killing this black market. I think people should stop talking about that. So and we also know that the operators make themselves very difficult to find deliberately and specifically, and are effective in doing that. So the best way to do it is constrict the channels that allow them to do it. And yes, the social networking platforms are part of that.
And on the accountability, we spoke about, treating the consumer individually, or noticing like his exposure can be individual to the black market. So do you view measures like public awareness campaigns, do they make any difference?
They should. Whether they do, I don't know, but they ought to, and they should. And I think that if, for example, this is just an example, and I think it would be effective, if we worked with a jurisdictional regulator or a government on a campaign together, so operators and regulators work together on a campaign, which that campaign is encouraging betting a responsible way, where that campaign is emphasizing what a black market is, or producing a blacklist, or educating the public on what the ills or dangers of a black market are, and by extension, what the benefits of a regulated market are. I would hope that a percentage or a proportion of that demographic would themselves behave responsibly on a national basis.
But if we reflect on the regulatory makeup of the industry, and across every continent, it's fragmented by country to country. There's no such a thing as, a regulatory kind of harmonization between markets in iGaming. And isn't this the condition where the black market thrives? And another question I'm going to ask you is that, how are kind of these international agencies, like you mentioned, Interpol or the FBI, how are they examining and evaluating the black market threat?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what they're doing. And the reason I don't know what they're doing is because it's not a discussion point at that level. I haven't seen it. So I must be assuming that either they're doing it very secretly, and I wouldn't understand why they would be doing it, or they'd be speaking about it a lot more openly and working with governments, if that's your question.
But I'm surprised at that response, especially in an age where, you read daily about crypto money laundering, online threats, and to have these massive international agencies, don't they kind of view that the black market is kind of triangulated or intertwined with other criminal activities online?
I mean, again, I think it's a sensible question, and I appreciate your concern that they're not looking at it, but that's part of my concern too, Ted. I don't think they are. I think they should be. And I think, but a precursor to that might be regulators and governments working together first. And we're not seeing much of that either.
Yeah, because I guess what I'm trying to get to is that, look, from a regulatory basis, everything's fragmented, but from a criminal basis, everything seems to be intertwined. So where kind of do these two worlds, where can they kind of clash? Where do they clash together? And where do you kind of see any resolutions coming if things are so different between the stakeholders?
I can certainly say that unless we find a solution which is cohesive, this black market is going to grow. And if this black market continues to grow, it's going to continue eating away at the regulated markets. And if it keeps killing the regulated markets and the likes of us and our competitors who all want to behave responsibly and legitimately cannot operate, well, then it's the death of that. And I don't think we want to talk about that or go in that direction. I think we do have opportunity to make inroads, but I think And I think, Ted, I think it's starting to happen. I don't think it's going as quickly as we do, but the very fact that we're sitting here today talking about this is a step in the right direction, because we weren't having this conversation a year ago. And I presume that it wasn't of as much interest a year ago to you, Ted, as it is today. And that in itself, I think, is progress.
Okay. I want to kind of get your thinking, your feelings on resolution, settlements, and what is effective, what works. So let's talk about the intervention of the black market. I mean, where do you view what policies work against stopping the exposure and stopping the encroachment?
Okay. I think the first thing is what we call channelization. And channelization is usually the movement of a grey to a regulated market, where you can make sure that all of those players remain within that regulated system and don't go outside. Now let's look at Ontario as an example of that. Ontario had a flourishing grey market. It then decided to regulate voluntarily. It started that process by openly and proactively speaking to operators as to what they thought would be effective, what they should do, what they shouldn't do. They launched their regime transparently with a lot of input and consultations with operators. And what happened as they had a regime which was open to everyone, provided you were suitable. So there was limitless licenses, essentially limitless brands. And they then went, and everyone working together, as they regulated that regime, there was in effect a result of approximately 90% of channelization. That means 90% of that demographic was then bound up into the regulatory regime, which meant that you had essentially and effectively limited any move to the black market at that early stage. And so that's just an example of how you can do that. So any country that is thinking of regulating should probably look at what Ontario did in terms of channelization, because we're focusing on the black market here, and there is a direct link between channelization and the black market. And so the first thing that regulators have to do is do it properly. After that, make sure, as I've mentioned before in the previous podcast session, that you aren't making life too difficult for legitimate customers in a regulated regime, so that they are encouraged for different regions to go to a black market.
So very much open market, good regulations, and, really, really concentrate on that channelization. Now, going back to the channelization rates, can you reflect on a market like Germany, where they put a lot of centralized controls, limited, really put in some restrictions on the gaming products and the live betting markets, and we see a regulator that completely just doesn't process that there's a black market there. The channeling rate has gone down to about 50%. What's your view on that fallout?
Okay, first of all, let's remember what I said in the first session, that the German regulator released figures that they said was 4%, the black market. So already we know how wrong that is. Now, it begs the question, well, why would a regulator come out with numbers which were clearly, from an industry perspective, wrong? I don't know. The German situation is a very peculiar one. We know that there's an element of monopolistic practice going on in Germany, state by state, because, of course, it's very much a state-by-state governmental regime. And so there's a question of protectionism there and influence. After that, maybe the wrong voices are being listened to. If you listen too much to prohibitionists, and sometimes that's for political reasons, you don't want to have it on the ticket. You don't want to even raise the question of gambling on a ticket, because it might look like you are actually rubber stamping gambling as a form of entertainment. And therefore you're putting in all of these additional frictions, obstacles, affordability rules, central databases, whatever they're doing and whatever's motivating them to do it, we know that it's not working. We as operators have been complaining to the German regulators for a long time. I think they're starting to listen now, but certainly there is no cohesion among states. There seems to be monopolistic interests being protected. There seems to be other political parties involved. I'm not sure there's complete transparency. And it's certainly a problem. From our perspective, though, we still see Germany as a market we can grow in. We're licensed there, but we do want to work more closely with that regulator. And also, and I want to add another thing, Ted, which is very much part of what's going on in Europe is, we would like to be able to rely more on EU laws in a way that would assist us, or in Europe. But the reality is that at certain times, or certainly in respect of this industry in Germany and in Austria, for example, there hasn't been much judicial homage paid to EU principles.
I want to move you on to the future and future safeguards. So let's begin with what should the repercussions be on the black market, anyone involved in the black market, and how should government authorities penalize bad actors?
Well, in the old days, Ted, I think it was you'd be drawn and quartered, right? But I'm not calling for that type of capital punishment. But look, I do think that there should be commensurate punishment for a crime, and these are crimes. Now, how do you do that, or who do you punish? I think that if you are able to punish those that are enabling this or facilitating it in terms of the ecosystem, I think you should have a look at those people. Maybe they are easier to get to and to threaten than the operators themselves who sit there making money hand over fist through different layerings of companies in different countries where they know they can't be caught. So, yes, ultimately we would want the operators to be punished, but we also have to be realistic in that it's very hard to get to them because they make a point of not being gotten to. And therefore we have to look at the journey and those who may be enabling these illegal acts and seeing whether you can put pressure there, because I think that would be effective.
Yes. And I think that's where I'm kind of trying to tap your brain, as in, I think that this is a part of kind of the discussion. It's like, how do you penalize it? But also, is it, I mean, if you give someone a £20,000 fine, isn't that just a slap on the wrist? And do we then go to a point where it's what is the condition for doing something illegal online? Are we talking about blacklisting managers or executives that they should never be able to work in the industry again?
I think that, let's look at these different types of ways you can prosecute and the law itself. There's a difference between, civil liabilities, administrative liabilities, and criminal liabilities. When you move stuff into or you move transgressions into the realm of criminal, well, that's where you want to do it. These fines you talk about tend to be administrative, not criminal. Or you could sue someone on a civil basis. Where being sued for money, where people are worth billions or hundreds of millions, it's of no consequence to them. They don't care. What people care about is a criminal conviction, because a criminal conviction carries, and a criminal conviction carries independently of an amount you have to pay. That's not what's relevant in a criminal conviction. It's the fact of the criminal conviction. It goes on your record. And once that happens in a world of AI and open source, that information's going to travel very widely. And once you have a criminal conviction, it's going to stop you being able to do a lot of other things in this world, which you don't want to be stopped from doing.
So let me take this to Supergroup. And, Supergroup invest big money in going into markets, advertising, getting their product out there. But how are you kind of communicating or cooperating with the authorities to say, look, these are the bad guys, and this guy's clearly, these people are clearly targeting vulnerable consumers, and they're using these affiliates and these channels, and are the authorities listening?
Okay, well, first of all, I am specifically trying to open those doors with regulators. I'm trying to talk to them more. It's happening slowly, but I'm hoping that these doors will continue to open wider, and they will lend us their ears. that is all I can say at this point. We keep trying to explain to regulators that if we cannot operate in a market because they make it commercially non-viable, too higher taxes, the cost of putting in too many technical interventions in relating to social responsibility, stuff that makes it very difficult for us to be in a market, we are forced to leave. We as a business will decide which of our markets are commercially viable or not. And unless they're helping us, we have to leave. And as soon as players like ourselves who are responsible and regulated leave, you have immediately created an open door for a black market.
Do you think there are too many loopholes for the black market? And to me, it seems like it's a very, very hard segment to convict or to go after.
I'm not sure I'd call them loopholes, Ted, but I would certainly say there's technical availability and modernity, which is allowing black market to flourish, the likes of crypto, Telegram, social networking platforms. And once we know that, it's a question of what would be effective in really constricting the black market by working with all of those enablers.
Okay, so final question. This has been a very disruptive decade for gaming, from a regulatory front and also from a commercial standpoint too. But how do you see kind of the black market as a subject matter evolving in the final kind of 5 years of this decade?
I think it's difficult to see how quickly this will start to move, but it's starting to move. And I would think that in 5 years' time, I think there's going to be a lot more effective ways that the black market would have been constrained. And I think that in 5 years' time, those black marketeers are going to have a lot less money to play with and a lot less markets to target.
Anthony, it's been an absolute pleasure and for this eye-opening discussion. Thanks so much.
Ted, it's been a pleasure and thanks very much.